everyone, Jolene here from Bookworm Adventure Girl. You may have been seeing a challenge going around BookTube called Has Steve Read It? I hadn't heard of it before, being fairly new to BookTube, but this challenge is in its second season, and I've seen a number of the channels that I follow attempt this challenge, and after giving it a bit of thought, I decided to attempt it as well. So first, I have to confess that when I saw this challenge, I had no idea who Steve was, and I am only just starting to realize how much I have been missing out on. I've wondered if I've been living under a rock or something, because it turns out that Steve Donoghue is like a walking reading machine. It's his job, and the guy reads massive amounts of books and reads widely across genres. So I am still getting to know more about Steve. I'm now I'm now following him on BookTube, Instagram, and Goodreads. And I have not gone back into his vault of videos, so I really still have little information about what he has read. But what I did notice so far in the videos that I've seen of people entering the challenge is that I haven't seen much, if any, Canadian literature. So if you've been following my channel, you know that, diverse reading and Canadian literature are kind of my thing. So I thought that I would attempt to find 8 books from my Canadian shelves and see if Steve has read them. Now, there are guidelines to this challenge, which I think are more than fair. First, if you can only choose 8 books. So that limit seems more than reasonable to me. The idea is, don't pick 50 books hoping that one of them will be something that Steve hasn't read. The books that are chosen need to be books in English or translated into English, and this is fine since that's all I read. And finally, when choosing the books, you can't be a goofball and choose something that would be so limited, it would be obvious that not only has Steve not read it, but really no one else has either. So like no microwave manufacturing manuals, no book that only had 10 copies printed. The idea is to reciprocate the fairness and remember that this is for fun. So with all of these things in mind, I came up with 8 books from my Canadian shelves, and some are more popular than others. Some might say that all Canadian literature is obscure, which is one of the reasons that I like to highlight it on my channel. But all of these novels are available. They've had several printings, and even if I don't get any beans, which is how Steve rewards people for the books that he hasn't read, I will just be happy to hear what what he has to say about these books. Okay, so let's have a look at the 8 books. First up is a historical fiction novel called Rush Home Road by Lansens. This novel takes place in a small town near what is now Chatham, Ontario. It's a couple of hours away from where I live, and some of its history has to do with the Underground Railroad. So Charlotte is 5 years old when her mother leaves her with their neighbor, the neighbor Addie, and the mother takes off. Addie ends up sharing some of her memories of where she grew up, about her family, and why she left home. And I just loved the characters in this novel. I love the bond that they develop. It has some really emotional moments, and I think it's very well written and just a beautiful story. The second book in the pile is The Way the Crow Flies by Anne-Marie MacDonald. Anne-Marie MacDonald might be better known for her novel Fall on Your Knees, which I think is also brilliant, and I think it was part of the Oprah Book Club at some point. The Way the Crow Flies is another historical fiction novel that really shouldn't be overlooked, just because Oprah hasn't done a plug for it. This story takes place in the 60s, and it centers around the MacArthur family, who moved to an Air Force base in a little town called Centralia. And the story begins with kind of setting the mood for what living on an air base is like for the officers, their wives, and their families. So the father in the story, Jack, is keeping secrets. The mother is trying to be the perfect military wife, and they have 2 children, Mike and Madeline. Madeline is 8 years old, and she is also keeping secrets. And when a young girl from Madeline's class is found murdered, it causes an uproar in the community. And a teenage boy is arrested for her murder, but the question is, did he really do it? And I loved that much of the story is told from Madeline's point of view. And again, I think the character development and the plot are done so well. Anne-Marie MacDonald is an author that I think is very underappreciated. And the way she based this story around the true story of Stephen Truscott, whose family lived on the Air Force Base in Clinton, Ontario, and the murder of 12-year-old Lynn Harper, I think it's done to perfection. So next on the pile is a humor book for another author that I think is underappreciated, in my opinion, and that is Up and Down by Terry Fallis. Terry Fallis is best known for his book Best Laid Plans, and the 3rd book in that trilogy is coming out this year. But one of my favorites is Up and Down, and David Stewart decides to revitalize NASA's PR by doing a lottery for 1 Canadian citizen and 1 American citizen to travel to space. Who he gets is not what he's expecting. The Canadian is a 71-year-old woman from rural BC who is a bush pilot and has always dreamt of being an astronaut, and she is such a delight, especially put up against this Texan counterpart. So Fallis writes older characters so well, and this novel has all of the usual Fallis elements, quirky characters, laugh out loud moments, and a really feel-good read. Number 4 is Clara, Callan by Richard B. Wright, which has won the Giller Prize and the Governor General's Award. So this might be a yes from Steve, but I'm including it just in case. We will see what he says. This story takes place in the 1930s in a village in northern Ontario and in New York City. 2 sisters, Clara and Nora. They couldn't be more different. Clara is a school teacher and a homebody. She doesn't like change, wants everything to stay the same. Nora has ambition and wants to become a famous radio actress in New York City. So what surprised me most about this book is that it is written in journal entries and letters, and I usually don't care for that, but for some reason this book is an exception. It allowed for the reader to be inside the minds of both sisters, and I found it more interesting to learn what Clara chose to share with her sister and what she chose to keep for her journals. And it helped to give a much more full experience of who she is. So both sisters face their own struggles and they have a fierce loyalty to one another. It's a good one. I really enjoyed it. So if you follow my channel, then you know that I read a lot of Indigenous authors, and more Indigenous authors are being published, which is fantastic. So I chose 3 Indigenous authors to share. I figure if Steve is up on his reading and what's out there, then maybe 2 or 3 of these authors would be on his radar. So we will see. The first is a Métis woman who was one of the first Indigenous women to be published in Canada. And her memoir continues to be published and taught in some of our schools. So Halfbreed by Maria Campbell is a powerful memoir. It's about her childhood, growing up in her community in Saskatchewan. She is the oldest of 8 children, and she has to leave school when her mother dies, so she can take care of the home and her younger siblings. Maria married very young. She had a daughter, and she shares her really intimate stories and personal stories about her marriage and how she ended up being a sex worker in Vancouver. And then eventually she also turned to drugs and alcohol to cope. So the story is not so much about these things happening, but why they happened. So the book is really more about survival, and survival from colonization, oppression, racism, and violence. And I think that this is such an important read. So next is Midnight Sweatlodge by Waubgeshig Wright. Waub, as we affectionately call him, has become much more popular since the publication of Moon of the Crusted Snow, and he is currently working on the sequel for that. But I thought that I would include Midnight Sweatlodge because it is a little book that packs a lot of punch. In this story, the tradition of a sweat is used to tell the story of 4 people. It begins with people entering the Sweatlodge, some of them for their first sweat, which, you know, I would predict might also be the first experience of readers to even hear of a sweat, never mind actually experiencing one. So 7 large stones, called the 7 grandfather stones, are placed in the pit in the middle of the lodge, and they are heated, and the sweat lodge gets, hotter and hotter. It's very much like a sauna, and the purpose of the sweat is healing. People share what is bothering them in their lives. Others listen and bear witness. And this book, I think, does 2 things beautifully. It allows the reader, like myself, to learn 4 experiences of what contemporary life is like on a reserve. So we learn about struggles such as domestic violence, suicide, and alcohol abuse, and we learn about Indigenous culture, spirituality, and storytelling, and it's told in a very compelling way. And then second, for an Indigenous reader who can relate more to these stories, I would imagine that it would remind them that the old teachings and that the traditions are still open and available to them. And it's a quick but very impactful novel. So at number 7, I have a crime story by Wayne Arthurson called The Red Chesterfield. It is probably the most unique, quirky, funny, and odd book I've ever read. The story is about the main character, M. He is a bylaw officer who comes across a red Chesterfield that has been left in a ditch. His curiosity gets the best of him, and he finds a shoe in the back of the Chesterfield. Inside the shoe is a severed foot. So now M finds himself in the middle of a murder investigation. And I just thought that this book was brilliant. The structure itself is interesting. Every chapter is no longer than page. Some are only a sentence long. And not only did I love how the story was told, but I loved the quirky characters and how the author was able to have so many layers to this, and it's such a short story. So it's another good one. And then finally, I have another author that I don't think gets enough attention, and that is Jane Urquhart. And I've loved so many of her books, and from the videos that I've seen, I gather that Steve likes history. So I chose Urquhart's nonfiction book called A Number of Things, Stories of Canada Told Through 50 Objects. What I love about this book is that Urquhart has chosen 50 objects to describe the experience of Canada and Canadians, and they are not the objects that you might think. Some of the objects are like tractors, skull, turban, leggings, books, skates, even a tiger. And I just think that this is a very interesting concept, to look at your country through objects. So those are the 8 books that I'm offering up for the challenge. Steve, hopefully there's something new on this list for you to ponder. But regardless, I am looking forward to just seeing your response. I will leave a link to Steve's channel in the description box below, so if you haven't already checked Steve's channel out, please do that. And I will also leave a list of the books that I chose for the challenge. Please let me know if you have read any of these, and if you are a booktuber, maybe consider doing this challenge if you haven't already. Thanks for watching, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your day, and don't forget to make every day an adventure.